of Great Britain to Ukraine. Mr. Simon Smith, he will present the situation of Great Britain in accordance on the similar situation.
On the British position on the developments in Ukraine. So the floor is yours, Mr. Messer.
Well, good morning, everybody, and nice to be back here for, I think, the fourth or the fifth time in recent months. I'm going to start just by making a few comments on latest developments, because I know that the issues on a lot of people's mind immediately will be the developments we saw yesterday with a number of high-level visits to Kiev and the prospect that the German Chancellor and the President of the French Republic will continue on to Moscow today. You'll understand why, as a representative of British diplomacy, I may not be in a position to give you a fantastic amount of details, and in fact it would probably be inappropriate for me to be commenting in great detail on that. But I think it's important just to put on record that from the standpoint of the British government, we very much welcome these latest efforts, which we understand to be very much motivated by a desire to put the peace process back on track, to put the ceasefire in the Donbass back on track, to talk about how that ceasefire, agreed, as we all remember, in the context of meetings in Minsk in September last year, how that process can be revived, can be put on track. And we remember that what was agreed in Minsk in September last year was the outline of a ceasefire and quite a number of arrangements as to how that ceasefire would be implemented, but also looking further than that at a more broader sort of long-term peace plan for the region. And the British government very much supports all efforts to revive momentum behind both ceasefire and peace plan. We very much supported the Minsk agreements when they were promulgated in September last year, and we thought that they at least set out a viable and implementable framework for de-escalation of the situation and for return to a situation in which all regions of Ukraine could concentrate on the priorities of economic development and how they continued to turn their country into a strong and successful one. And so to that extent, we were obviously disappointed and extremely concerned to see the lack of progress in implementing the ceasefire, to see how, as the daily figures of casualties and deaths and injuries, both to combatants and civilians, how those figures kept on mounting up. We saw how the ceasefire, how the ability to implement the ceasefire had weakened. And so, as I say, to that extent, we welcome the attempts to renew effort to put arrangements back in place, which will lead to a situation in which we're not seeing these distressing and disturbing daily figures of casualties, and we're not seeing the obviously distressing and disturbing stories of the impact that this is having, the situation is having on the civilian populations of the region. The British government also very much hopes that in the context of this latest effort to revive and to bring further life back into ceasefire and peace plan arrangements, that we will see a significantly increased level of commitment from the Russian Federation in participation in constructive efforts to restore peace and stability to the region. We remember going back almost a year year now that it was the very clear call of European Union heads of state and government that Russia should take efforts to de-escalate the situation, and that it should cease its efforts to destabilize Ukraine. It's the position of the British government that we have seen woefully little on either count from Russia so far, and by contrast, we have seen consistent attempts by Russia to deny responsibility for what is going on there. It's our view that it is obvious to any observer that the military activities of the separatist militants in the Donbass could not have been undertaken without significant Russian support. And so against that background, we feel it is very much time now in this latest effort to revive implementation of the ceasefire and to revive implementation of the peace plan. It really is time for Russia to shape up and take responsibility, to acknowledge its role in this destabilization, to acknowledge its role in the conflict, and to acknowledge its responsibilities in participating in the effort to restore peace to the Donbass. I want also, just before throwing the session open to your questions, just to say that one more strand of effort in which the British government remains very heavily engaged is our support to the Ukrainian government for its efforts to progress the agenda of modernization and reform that lies in front of it. We have been consistent in our support for the development of a Ukraine which is stronger, more successful, which emerges with its sovereignty and independence enhanced as a result of processes of reform. And against that background, we are continuing a very close engagement with the government of Ukraine, as a lot of you will know, many of whose personalities and decision makers have changed in the last few weeks. But we've been encouraged by what we've heard in talking to a lot of the key decision makers in the new government, and particularly encouraged by the numbers of people we've spoken to who have said to us, we have a war going on in our country. We have an immense challenge in resisting aggression visited upon us by our neighbor, but we will not let that be an excuse. We will not let that be a reason for not getting on with the vital reforms that need to remain on our agenda. And from the standpoint of the British government, a government, as I said, very supportive of Ukraine's efforts to develop itself into strength and success, we welcome that attitude, and we will be equally determined to continue our efforts in support of a reforming government. We will continue to help our partners in the Ukrainian government to coordinate their efforts on reform. And also, I think we will sustain an argument which says we will sustain our efforts to help them also ensure that they have a clear idea of what the key priorities on the reform agenda should be. And just to list up a couple of those areas, I think that we are one of many of Ukraine's friends and partners who would put a successful policy to tackle corruption right at the top of the list of reform items. And again, we've been encouraged to hear not just from members of the new government, but from members of the relatively new parliament, how much of a new spirit of commitment has come in actually to facing down corruption, to understanding that without a successful effort to tackle corruption, the chances of success elsewhere on the reform agenda are severely handicapped. I think alongside the effort on corruption, we would place a very heavy emphasis on success in implementing an agenda of deregulation. It's a commonplace to say that every regulation is a potential opportunity for a corrupt transaction. Ukraine, in our view, remains still a heavily over-regulated economy, an over-regulated country, and we would certainly wish to carry on supporting our partners in the Ukrainian administration who work consonantly with us in order to move towards a business environment which stimulates production, stimulates creativity, stimulates competition, and sustains in place a business environment which is open, fairly competitive, and which gives businesses a fair chance to grow. In that context, I've been a bit disturbed lately to hear from one or two of our companies and our investors in Ukraine who talk about the extent to which they are still suffering from over-regulation. One or two companies, particularly in the energy sector, who have raised concerns about decisions taken on subsoil royalties, which have actually depressed production rather than encouraged production. It seems to us a strange time to be taking decisions which actually have as their effect that the companies reduce their production of energy resources rather than increase them. And we will be continuing our discussions with the Ukrainian government to persuade them that what they need to be doing is stimulating economic activity in their decision-making, and not taking decisions which actually encourage companies to reduce or shut down production. That's just one specific area of concern I've mentioned, but in a more general sense, as I say, in the technical assistance which the British government is providing to Ukraine, and in our political and diplomatic support, we will not only be standing by Ukraine in terms of support for the issues where I started, the support for the effective implementation of a ceasefire and peace plan, but also support for their reform efforts across the board with a particular focus on corruption and deregulation. That's all by way of introduction. I'm happy to take your questions now. Thank you.
On how the British government would like to see more pressure on Russia in order to change its behavior in Ukraine. Is the British government considering backing more sanctions against the Russian Federation with its European partners, or any other strategies to change their calculus in Ukraine?
Well, we very much see the whole sanctions policy as one that has a moving and developing dynamic. We absolutely don't see that is a strategy where we have kind of gone so far and we can go no further. I think it was very clear from the conclusions of the latest Foreign Affairs Council meeting of the European Union last Thursday, and the conclusions from that, I think, also made very clear that this is not a static policy of the European Union. It's a dynamic one. Instructions were given as a result of that meeting of the ministers for work to continue on looking at additional ways in which sanctions pressure can be maintained and indeed increased on Russia. So again, I think that's evidence of this being, as I say, a moving strategy, not a static one, and that's very much a position that the British government supports. We, as I've said in my earlier remarks, we do not consider that we've seen anything remotely looking like adequate responses from Russia so far, and we will continue to argue for policies which demonstrate progressively that there are costs to Russia for not responding to the call to engage constructively in an effort to stop the destabilization of Ukraine and to de-escalate the situation. Okay, sorry. Okay. Okay.
Здравствуйте.
Irena Ross. I am a private citizen. I have a question to you. Thank you very much for your speech today and the support that you've been given about corruption. Everybody knows that the policy of our state is in the fact that many banks were removed from the market, and there's a lot of people who suffered financially. I am a failed client of one of such banks, and I lost quite a lot of money, and the owner of our bank, Mr. Bakhmatyuk, is a successful businessman in London at the moment. Our state does not stop him, and he is not responsible before his clients, his customers. How can you help us in this situation? Probably by stopping his business and helping us get the money that he is now successfully earning in London.
I can't sort of comment in great detail on specific cases of which I'm not fully informed of the details, nor can, as a representative of the British government, can I obviously, do I have a role in inserting myself into kind of legal disputes between specific entities. What I will say is that clearly across the board, we in Britain will continue to ensure that our regulations on financial flows into the United Kingdom are thoroughly implemented. And again, I will say that in general terms, our arguments with the Ukrainian administration will be that there exists a considerable degree of willingness and commitment on the part of the United Kingdom and on the part of many of Ukraine's neighbours and partners in the European Union to work positively alongside Ukrainian institutions, organisations and people as they continue to develop what, if it succeeds, will be the first and only successful effort to tackle corruption in Ukraine. But we will make the same point that we need to see evidence of success in this effort. There is, as I've said, a considerable degree of commitment to work with Ukraine on these issues, but our partners in the Ukrainian administration need to show some return on that commitment, need to show that they too are substantially prepared to commit themselves to real action in terms of tackling corruption. The numbers of administrations around the world who have often said that they are committed to the fight against corruption is huge. The numbers of administrations who, having said that, have actually gone on and done something about it is rather more modest. But we I think I'm encouraged by the numbers of people in the Ukrainian administration who tell me that they understand the extent now to which corruption is a strategic threat to Ukraine's sovereignty and survival. And to that extent, I think that we will continue to encourage this degree of commitment to the fight with corruption. And we will look to see that the efforts to implement this strategy are implemented with no exceptions, with no special treatment, and with no one exempt or immune, because above all, the effort needs to be to create an environment in which anyone in business has the opportunity to compete on a fair and open and competitive basis, and not on the basis of special privileges, special treatment, and special under-the-counter deals.
Здравствуйте, Макеевские новости.
Макеевские новости. Could you please tell us? I have two questions. First, what programs do you have this year to support public sector in Ukraine? And my second question is there a preparedness to help small and medium-sized businesses who may enter your market with original products?
Just to say that one of the central planks of our program of assistance to Ukraine is precisely in the area of supporting Ukraine's key ministries in implementing the policy reforms that they're carrying out. So we're working alongside a whole range of ministries with the Cabinet of Ministers. We're working with the Ministry of the Economy, with the Ministry of Finance, where we're participating in a project alongside the German government on public financial management reform. We have been working, for example, with the Ministry of Defence very intensively on areas that help them to bring integrity and effectiveness to their budgetary management. We consider that's a particularly important area. I just said a minute ago how many people recognize the threat that corruption is, the extent to which corruption is a strategic threat, and that's nowhere more visible than in the areas of defense budgeting and procurement, where, simply speaking, if you budget for defense resources and the resources you allocate to that are stolen or are misallocated, then you will be sending into the field forces who are under-equipped, with obvious risks to their lives and obvious risks to the capacity to defend the country. We are working across a broad plane to assist the areas of administrative reform, reform of the public service. On your second part of your question, we do not play a direct role in the promotion of business opportunities for Ukrainian companies in the United Kingdom or elsewhere in Europe. That's, in a sense, the job. In a sense, we play a role in promoting business opportunities for British companies in Ukraine, and we do that confident that many of them will bring know-how, they will bring investment, which itself contributes to the healthy development of the Ukrainian economy. But direct support for Ukrainian companies seeking opportunities in the UK, we would see that much more as the role of the Ukrainian embassy in London. However, I think it's fair to say that in terms of our support for progressing the deregulation agenda, in terms of our support for, again, I come back to anti-corruption, because if you don't have an effective fight against corruption, you sustain an environment in which it is much more difficult for small businesses to grow. So right across the reform agenda, we're very clear that the sort of changes that we want to help through our support for the reform agenda are ones that will allow small businesses the room to grow, the room to develop, and of course that includes the room to develop as exporters to other markets.
Hello, Simon. Adam Nathan. A couple of quick questions. You talked about evidence of success of corruption, and I wonder what you would judge as evidence. For instance, would you like to see some people brought to trial from the previous regime around the Maidan? There's been worries about why there's been a delay in this process. Is this something the British government feels would be one example of evidence of anti-corruption? And sort of linked question, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, it has some foreign people on it. The government's bringing in foreigners. Have you thought about trying to put a British person into that? And are you satisfied with the composition of that bureau and the mechanisms being put in place that it will be effective? That's my questions around corruption. And then I have just one slightly tricky question around the French-German initiative, which is to ask, the EU Foreign Affairs, Federica Modilani, she was at the NATO Defence Conference. We have the Foreign Affairs Council. We have a unified European position. So you may find this tricky to answer, but do you think it's right that two European countries go out on their own without Ukraine and make agreements, or start to make agreements that might be dubbed Minsk II, when Minsk hasn't been adhered to, as you've strongly advised it should have been, without Ukrainian involvement and without European consensus? Is that the European way to do things?
I don't see too much of. I'll answer your questions in reverse order. I don't honestly see too much of a problem. either in the sense that this initiative is somehow kind of not reflective of consensus in Europe. I think I saw, and I'm sure I saw a brief statement from Federica Mogherini on record as saying that this is very much in line with where the European Council, where the Foreign Affairs Council came out last week. I think that diplomacy is full of examples where a small group of countries or a small group of engaged parties sees the initiative and say, we see an opportunity here, we need to pick it up and run with it. So to that extent, I think we in the British government are not only kind of relaxed about the French-German initiative, we very much welcome it. Just on the other concern that you raised and I think as you put it, are we worried about initiatives that go on without sort of, I think as you put it, without including Ukraine? I mean, I do think it was very important that Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande were here yesterday. I think that shows exactly the answer to any concern that says, is this happening without Ukraine's involvement? Absolutely not. Coming on to corruption, I think it is obvious in the sense that, you can answer when you look at what it is you need to kind of demonstrate that things have changed, that assumptions that the old kind of corrupt practices can continue are no longer valid. That sure, I think it helps to demonstrate that in terms of taking action against corruption, that does mean taking action against corrupt people. But I think it also means taking action against corrupt practices. And I wouldn't seek to sort of say that one is more important than the other. I think they're both parts of an effective strategy against corruption. I think action against corrupt people demonstrates that corruption doesn't pay and that there are consequences for corruption. But I think action against corrupt practices also, and again I talked about deregulation, I talked about reducing the immense number of opportunities that there are for corruption. So again, I think in terms, when we come back to looking at evidence, yes, I think it is a good part of an effective anti-corruption strategy to show that there are negative consequences for persons involved in corrupt practices. But I also think it's important, and again, a very easy measure of success in action against corruption is actually measures of success in deregulation.
Mr. Master, just as a moderator, my last question: do you think supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine could serve and could deter Putin from further escalation? And do you think the British government will be willing to join the U.S. government if such decision is made there?
Well, we have been involved, and I briefly mentioned one aspect of our engagement with the Ministry of Defence, and I underlined how our activities with them to help them eliminate corruption in defence procurement and budgeting is something that we regard as absolutely in the mainstream of helping strengthen them to counter strategic threats. But that is just one example, and I think that we are very clear that our engagement with Ukraine on the military side of things, there is a very broad spectrum of support and assistance that Ukraine's partners can give, which in one way or another help to increase Ukraine's capacity to defend itself and help to increase Ukraine's capacity to deter aggression. And all that is part of a strategy of demonstrating that continuing aggression and that continuing destabilization has a cost. So in addition to the work we have been doing with the Ministry of Defence on corruption, on reforming their structures, we have also developed a program of assistance to the Ukrainian military in terms of providing for example, a lot of winter resilience equipment, a lot of equipment which helps them improve performance in the field and which helps them strengthen, again, as I referred to, strengthen their capacity to defend themselves and to deter against aggression. As I said, we regard this as a very broad spectrum of assistance. We are helping Ukraine at many points along that spectrum, and I'm sure that assistance will continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Messer.
Thank you very much.